Welcome to Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is April 21st, and my guest is Ariel Rubinstein of Tel Aviv University and New York University. Ariel, welcome to Econ Talk.
Nice to be here.
Now, you're a game theorist, a very respected game theorist, and you recently wrote an afterword for the 60th anniversary of von Neumann and Morgenstern's classic work on the theory of games. And you wrote it, you said explicitly, from the position of a skeptic. And,
that's correct.
And in that essay, you wrote, I'm going to read an excerpt from it, which was rather shocking when I came across it. So it's a little long. Bear with me, those of you out there. And Ariel, when I'm done, you can elaborate and comment.
Of course.
Here's the quote. So is game theory useful in any way? The popular literature is full of nonsensical claims to that effect. But within the community of game theorists, there is sharp disagreement over its meaning and potential usefulness. There are those who believe that the goal of game theory is ultimately to provide a good prediction of behavior in strategic situations, and even if we are not there yet, we will get there once we've enriched the models with additional parameters and come up with better ways of measuring the considerations of real players. I'm not sure on what this vision is based. Most situations can be analyzed in a number of ways, which usually yield contradictory predictions. Furthermore, we need also to deal with the fundamental difficulty of predicting behavior in the social sciences, where prediction itself is part of the game and forecasters are themselves players. Then there are those who believe in the power of game theory to improve performance in real-life strategic interactions. I have never been persuaded that there is a solid foundation for this belief. The fact that academics have a vested interest in it make it even less credible. There seems to be some regularity in strategic behavior, which becomes apparent in game theoretical experiments. It's gratifying to sometimes find similar distributions of modes of behavior across societies. But are these regularities related to the classical predictions of game theory? Others, including myself, think that the object of game theory is primarily to study the considerations used in decision-making in interactive situations. It identifies patterns of reasoning and investigates their implications on decision-making in strategic situations. According to this opinion, game theory does not have normative implications, and its empirical significance is very limited. Game theory is viewed as a cousin of logic. Logic does not allow us to screen out true statements from false ones and does not help us distinguish right from wrong. Game theory does not tell us which action is preferable or predict what other people will do. If game theory is nevertheless useful or practical, it is only indirectly so. In any case, the burden of proof is on those who doubt the practical value of game theory in the first place. So this was kind of a shocking thing to write as an afterwards. So my first question before we get into the content was, what kind of reaction have you gotten from your colleagues?
Well, first of all, I hear you reading it, and actually, first of all, I like it,
You still like it, huh?
My response is very positive, even I wrote it a few years ago. First of all, I do believe it. I'm skeptic, that's true, and I'm not ashamed on that. The opposite. I think that to be skeptic in academics, that's the fuel of academic life. And I think that one of the problems of economic theory in general in the years that I'm aware of it is that I do feel that there was too little skepticism and too much of a feeling that we are on the right track towards fulfilling some goals that personally I was not from the first sight I was not a believer of. Second, you see, there is one point that I emphasized in the paragraph that you read, which is the fact that many game theoreticians do feel or do want to find game theory to be applicable, applied. And my emotion from the beginning of my academic life, I've never felt that I have any obligation to do something which is useful, which is applied. I don't think that it's a sin, not at all. So if something that I do will pave the way to the moon or to cure cancer, I would be very happy. But I don't believe that that's the case, and I think that we should look in academic life in general to much more modest usefulness more from abstract point of view, from intellectual point of view, and not from the point of view, or not in the sense that most people understand in the word being useful, or the phrase being useful. Now, when you say statement, you ask about the response of the people around me. Well, people first of all know me, and they know me for many years, and I did not hide my views about it. It's true that probably I was less clear about my views when I was very young. I remember the first time that it was around the early 80s that I was participating in some conference, and somebody told me that he did some experiments that was not very consistent with, at least he thought that it was not very consistent with a model that I wrote about bargaining, and I didn't understand what he wanted for my life. Namely, of course, the model does not have to predict anything. It does not have to be verified in life. It's not a model like a model in physics is, and it was not used. It was not supposed to be useful in any way. I called it a model of bargaining because I wanted to emphasize that there are many models of bargaining, and my model is just one story, and there could be many stories, and if it's useful, it is in a very, very indirect way. So I think that with time, people got more and more to know me, and they understood that these are my views. It's true that it's only in the last 10 years or so, especially around, let's say, the late 90s, that I expressed my views in a more coherent way, and I felt it more clear in my voice about the role or the usefulness or the non-usefulness of game theory. Now, you see, I have to say also that, of course, some people did not like it. I did not like it at all. It's not that I got some threats to my life, but and I fully understand why, because I think that many people, and I say it very positively about themselves, feel that they should do something useful in life. And again, let me emphasize, I say it's something I say it very positively about them. I think that there are people who were educated, who were brought up on the idea that they are not allowed just to be professors in universities just for thinking, for the sake of thinking, but they need to do something that will be useful in the regular sense of the word. So I think that for them it's not easy to accept this position. Now, of course, I should also say, and we should not hide it, that there are, and especially in the last 15 years or so, it was not like that, I think, 20 or 30 years ago, but in the last 15 years or so, we are also experiencing some economic interest around. And that's because once game theory became applied in the sense that there are companies that give, or individuals that give, becoming consultants and giving advices, and also get some nice amounts of money in return, then, of course, the interest also play a role. We are overall, and we economists are, and game theoreticians in particular, are also human beings, and we are economic agents, and that's something that we also take into account. So it's not, again, I don't blame anybody for cheating or something like that. The opposite, I think that there are very moral and very nice people around game theory. But I think the interests are also in the background, and at least I think I fully understand that some of the people that felt that their work, or feel that their work is very, very useful in a very concrete way, are either driven by very idealistic positions about academic life, or are driven by more human incentives or interests like other people. So again, I don't feel isolated, not at all, from time to time. By the way, one of the nice things about these sort of positions that I get from time to time. Look, it's not the case that every day I get responses and many emails from thousands of people. That's not the case, of course. But I think that it's nice to get very positive responses from young people, from students. And it's nice because, I think that it's coming from something more pure, and in general, I believe in young people more than I believe in people in my age.
Well, listeners will hear some echoes from a recent interview we did with Freeman Dyson, where he talked about the value of being a heretic, and made some similar comments about the reliability of science. We're talking now about social science, about economics, and about game theory in particular. But it is a fascinating thing, and I think that, in my experience, when you confront people with the idea that their certainty is not as high as they claim it to be, their reaction is very angry and aggressive. They don't say, "Oh, that's interesting. Well, maybe I should be a little more..." No, actually what they respond with is, "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand. You don't know the field." But in your case, they can't say that. You know what you're talking about, and you do know the field, and it's awkward. Some people must be very defensive.
Some people are very defensive, and I guess that some people probably will not say it in my face, will say some bad things about me, and I will not hate them for that. I understand that this is the game of life, and for saying that, I don't need to know game theory. By the way, one point that I would like to also to emphasize that I do believe that many of the game theoreticians and the economic theoreticians in general could make a lot of difference to the world. But my argument would be the following. I think that what's happened is that the economic theory attracted many smart people, many very smart people. And what is the difference between game theory or economic theory and, let's say, pure mathematics is that those people who come to economic theory are very often also with a very good touch to the world. So it's not that it's not only that their IQ is very high, but they have also, to do game theory, you do need some touch to the world, in the sense of understanding how people argue, what is important in a situation, and so on. Now that's something that you don't learn in game theory, but I think that if you're a good game theoretician or a good economic theoretician, then this is a virtue that you need to come with. So I think that what's going on is that game theory and economic theory, many of the people who work in these fields have this special ability of high analytical ability and some touch to the world, which makes them very valuable independently of the theories or the concepts that they come with. Namely, I do believe very much that if you take an intelligent person, like many of the names that we have in mind, I don't want to mention particular names here, and you tell them, okay, in the next year you don't do game theory, you just consult to the American government agency or to the Israeli army or to some private company, and I do believe that these people will give many good advices. They will also give many very bad advices, but some of the good advices will be quite original and let me say even valuable from social or economic or whatever point of view. But this does not mean the fact that people who are describing themselves as game theoreticians or are game theoreticians, not just describing themselves, that the fact that they are really useful in the concrete sense does not mean, not at all, that they really use the theory itself. Now, of course, to a game theory like logic, like the Talmud, like many other philosophy, these are fields that sharpen the brain and etc., etc. And in this respect, it trains people to contribute something to the world and add to it, as I said before, that to be a successful academics, you have to be also original. And originality, again, it's not something that you learn. It's something that you are born with, or your mother gave you with her milk. So that makes actually some of the game theory, permanent game theoreticians, quite valuable from social point of view. Also from, but the one thing that I disagree with many of those people is that I disagree that they really use game theory. And one of the things that let me say something personal. One of the things that motivates me a lot in life is my hate to pretension and my hate to use of authority in cases that there is no real authority to be based on. And it's very tempting. It's very tempting, and I can say that in my own life I also was confronting with this temptation. It's very tempting to say, I know something that you don't know. I'm a professor. I'm a game theoretician. I know some people who won the Nobel Prize, etc., etc. And therefore, listen to me. I know some things that you, the layman, the politician, etc., don't know.
Yeah, it's very seductive.
It's tempting, yeah. But I think that we should, and personally I hope that I did succeed to not to be tempted by that, and the opposite. And I did, in the last 10 years or so, I did, many times I did talk in some public gatherings, or I gave some public lectures in Israel, and I writing from time to time in the newspaper in Israel. And one thing that I emphasize in the first sentence is that, listen, I'm talking with you as a citizen of Israel, a citizen of the world, but not at all as expert to anything which is relevant.
It's a very deep observation. I've been struck by it in the current economic situation, and I may have made this joke before in an earlier program, but people come up to me and say in the middle of the crisis, boy, people must be coming to you for answers. And I always say, not the smart ones, because I don't have any answers. I may have an insight or two from the study of economics, but people don't want an insight or two. They want the truth. They want the answer. They want the solution. And as you say, there's such a temptation, a seductiveness to being treated with honor and glory as if you're something special. And what I find interesting...
Exactly, and by the way, you use the word solution that people look so much to. But I think that the game theory, one part of the success of game theory is the rhetorics that was used by game theory. And the word solution, the term solution, we talk about solutions in game theory. We don't just talk about equilibrium, we talk about solutions. And this word in English or in Hebrew, I think that it triggers people to believe that here we give something very concrete, really a solution to a dilemma, a solution to some conflict.
And there's a famous example of which I enjoy it. It's an example of a shipwreck. I think it's in a novel by Joseph Conrad. I think it's in Typhoon, where all the jewels and boxes of treasure that people have put on board get all mixed up together. And we have the problem now is that how do you get people to ask, to tell the truth about what was in their box? Because everyone will have a tendency to exaggerate. So there's a very elegant solution. We'll not talk about it here, but there's a very elegant solution that will encourage people to tell the truth. And the idea is you don't give people back necessarily what they say, but you compare what they say and what everyone says to the total amount. And it's a beautiful, beautiful, elegant piece. I think there was a little article on it in the Journal of Political Economy. But the idea that would work the first time as a solution in the chaos and the aftermath of a typhoon when people are traumatized, that they would just all act like the game theorists say they would, is stupid. It's there's a logical beauty to it, but no captain would use it. He'd be a fool to use it.
Yeah, and I think that this is true about many of the so-called game theoretic solutions. It's like logic. It shows something. We learn something from it. We learn something which might be useful, might be not useful. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But to say that the fact that I wrote a model and I have some implementation problem and I found some mechanism and which the Nash equilibrium or even the only Nash equilibrium or the only subimperfect Nash equilibrium or the only whatever equilibrium is something that I would like actually to implement, to say that this is actually something close to be a recommendation to the world. I think that I wouldn't call it stupid, but I would call it, it's pretentious without a good justification.
So the other thing I want to observe about your point, which I think is very true, that people like to be seen as experts and treated with seriousness. It's interesting to me that I think most game theorists, most economists generally, would be insulted when told, well, most of your insights come from the fact that you're really smart. And yes, it's useful to have studied economics. It hones the mind, and I would even go farther than that. It sensitizes you. Economics does generally. It sensitizes you to unseen effects. It sensitizes you to the effect of incentives. It sensitizes you to the role of market forces, which are very difficult sometimes to be aware of. And for a game theorist, you're sensitized to strategic interactions, and those can be very important. And yet no one says, this had nothing to do with my training. It's just me. I'm smart. That we'd think might be attractive. That might be a nice identity. But what you point out is what actually does happen. People don't want to sell themselves that way. They sell themselves as the keeper of the flame, the person who has this insight from the club, from the cadre of insiders called economists or game theorists. I just find that psychologically interesting.
Right. Yeah, I think that many of the people would love to describe themselves as smart, but I think that it's just it's very difficult to say. Okay, I am smart. My IQ is such and such. Listen to me. But on the other hand, it's very easy to say I have 50 papers in econometrica, and therefore I'm an expert on whatever. And now listen to me. And by the way, it's not just a blame. Again, it's not a matter of evilness. By the way, in general, I don't believe in. There are very few people who are evil. I think that it is a sort of, in some sense, it's an equilibrium of the world. Namely, the desire to get advice of this type is coming from somebody wants to get the advice, and somebody wants to pay for that, and somebody would like to listen, and somebody would like to transfer responsibility from himself if he's a politician or a businessman or whatever, and to cover himself. And then, of course, in extreme cases, the worst case in some sense, the worst for me is that when people are presenting political views, and this is definitely true about my own country, where there are some people who are supporting their political views with sort of scientific justification.
That only happens in Israel, Ariel. It doesn't happen in the United States. We're all just scientists here.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. No, we have the same problem here. It's a horrible, and it's a dishonesty. The worst part is it's dishonest. We pretend we're scientists. We're not. We're clothing our biases in scientific rhetoric.
Again, but I would be softer than you in one point. I would not say that it is dishonest. I would say that this is that we are cheating ourselves. That the desire of people to make claims which are not just their views and are not just derived from their ideological positions, and somehow is so strong that people are just persuading themselves that in their position. So I'm just saying I don't want to stick any evilness or any dishonesty to anybody. Not at all. The opposite. I think that some of the people who do it are very, very honest people and very fine people. But I just think that they are wrong in their positions.
Yeah, no, I agree with that softening. I've been thinking a lot lately of, for those of you who remember our series of podcasts on the theory of moral sentiments, there's the line in Adam Smith, I'm paraphrasing slightly, he says, man wants to be loved and to be lovely. We want to have people think highly of us, and we want to earn that respect and honor. And so we have a tendency to delude ourselves that we've actually earned it when in fact we haven't. The basic impulse is good. It's good to be to be liked for genuine reasons, but we have a tendency to self-deceive, and it's a human, as you say, it comes with the mother's milk.
I fully agree.
Yeah. So let's move on. I want to talk about a rather iconic example from the behavioral economics literature that you've critiqued in a paper on behavioral economics. Happens to be an example that came up in the podcast with Dan Pink. And it may have come up, I think it came up another time, I've forgotten which podcast. But it's this now famous example of an Israeli daycare center where this daycare center, they had a problem. People were coming late. They were having trouble arriving on time. And people were taking advantage a little bit of the daycare center. And they were waiting. They were coming late to pick up their kids. So as an experiment, they instituted a fine that if you were late picking up your kids, you had to pay an additional fee. And they found out that it actually increased the number of people who came late. And this was seen as some sort of refutation potentially of downward sloping demand curves. And I think a lot of the claims for this example are overblown. But I want to get your reaction to the science of it and the objectivity of it.
Yeah, I rather prefer probably to talk about in general about this the experimental economics or experimental game theory, experimental economics methods or assumptions. You see, my interaction with experimental game theory or experimental economics started when I met many years ago the late Amos Tversky. And my first interaction with Amos Tversky, who then became quite a friend of mine until he died in 96, was a meeting where more or less I told him, Amos, I don't understand what are you doing. What you're doing is completely obvious. I don't understand why you need experiments to support your observations. You understand how people reason. You have interesting observations about those, and now it's enough that you write those observations like philosophers. Philosophers usually, traditionally, don't support their observations with experiments. And the interaction with Amos for a few years, including one paper that we wrote together, taught me a lot about the meaning of experimental economics. I do still believe that most of the interesting stuff in experimental economics is something that people, first of all, it comes from smart, it's not smart people, it's people with understanding how people, with good observations, ability to observe how people think and reason, and of course with ability to make some abstraction from that. And once they come up with some observation, if the observation is good, that usually you hear it and you say, yes, that's correct. So in the introspection, in some sense, the introspection, which I believe is the main tool of the experimental economics or the cognitive psychologist, is something that overall this is the most important tool in this field. Nevertheless, rightly so, we require that from a social point of view, we require that it's not enough to say, I believe that, or I think that, and I checked with two friends, or my son or my wife, but we need a little bit more than that, and then actually it's become quite an art. And I think that people like Amos Tversky or Daniel Kahneman were really first, they are like artists for me. Namely, they have this wonderful ability to take such an observation, probably introspection, probably observing other people thinking and reasoning, and somehow inventing some sort of scenario or some sort of experiment that demonstrates the point very well. That's something which is not easy. Once we see the experiment, sometimes we feel, wow, that's so easy, everybody can do it. But that's not the case. In the one paper that I wrote with Amos, we had about, I don't remember, 20 or 30 pilots until we came to the final phrase of the experiments that we did, and it's not me that I did it, it's Amos Tversky after so many years of experience, and nevertheless it was not trivial at all to find the right way to ask the question and to demonstrate the points that we wanted to demonstrate. At the point it was very clear, and we didn't have any doubt that the point exists in the human reasoning. So so my point is the following: one of the two. If you want if we say, okay, economics is really like philosophy, and it's enough to say we believe that some people reason in this way, or there is some element in the reasoning which is common to many of us, and so on, then we don't need experiments. If we do the experiments, then we need to do it in a very, very careful way, and it's not enough to claim that the conclusion is correct. In some sense, the conclusion is very clear from the beginning, and in some sense, you don't need the experiments to believe in the conclusion. In this particular case that you mentioned, I think that it's the common sense tells us that if you don't have to pay anything for some service, then you may actually be more considerable to the interest of the guy who gives you the service. On the other hand, if he charges you something, and it's a little bit annoying that he charges you this extra, then you start to do your maximization. And therefore, it might be that if the kindergarten teacher does not charge anything, then I will be quite careful to come on time. And if he charges a lot of money, I will be very careful to come on time to pick my child. And if she charges some peanuts, then or even a few dollars, then I would say, okay, so now it's worth for me to be late half an hour and to pay the $10. So this is something which, ask people in the streets. I think that most of them probably did not think about it in this abstraction, but they will agree that that's more or less the case. So if you want to say that's the case, and the incentives are not monotone in their influence, then
and also that there are non-monetary incentives, that there's cultural disapproval and other forces. That's not so complicated. It's part of economics too, right?
Right, but what I'm saying is that if you want just to say that's the case, then I don't think that you need to do any experiments. If you want to do experiments,
if you want to get an article
again,
published,
you have to judge the experiments and not the conclusions. And I think that one of the mistakes, the general mistake that many of us do, is that we say, here somebody phrased, and again, I don't refer to this particular case. I refer in general to many papers in experimental economics in the last 20 years, where actually people were quite impressed by the conclusion, probably because the conclusion was useful to construct new models. But in some sense, you didn't need the experiments to be persuaded. Now, as I said before, if you do the experiments, then I would like to require from the experiments to be done in the right way. Now, how do we usually judge experiments? I think that usually we judge experiments using some statistical tools, right? So there is some statistical test, and you run the program, and you get P equal whatever, and it's better that you get P below 5%, etc., and if you get 6%, it's disaster. If you get 4%, you are happy. And that's the end of the game. Now, my point is that one of the things that as a profession we hide or we don't take into account, the big uncertainty about results, in my opinion, is not the statistical uncertainty that usually is measured but the uncertainty about the way that the data is recorded, the uncertainty about the way that the experiment is done. And this is something that in my feeling is that economists are not critical enough. We don't check the details. We in general believe in it's not politically correct to say to somebody, well, I'm not sure that actually you have done the experiment in the protocol, the exact protocol that you are reporting to, and therefore this becomes the significance of the experiments that are reported in the literature for me, and again, without getting into details about case A or case B, in general, I'm much more skeptic about these facts. Let me be bold and probably shock you again. Most of the facts that are reported, I don't believe the facts. I believe the conclusions.
Yeah. No,
without the facts. And this is something which is, again, one thing that I learned in my life is that we are not angels, and there are very few angels in the world, and I'm not an angel. And working in experimental economics, it requires, in some sense, to be an angel. Namely, it's very easy to deceive yourself. It's very easy to do the wrong calculation and not to check the calculations if they go in your direction. When in the last 3 years I give lectures about neuroeconomics, and one of the things that I do in this lecture, I show some data about eye tracking data that I did with some work with a friend of mine from Weizmann Institute and a student from Tel Aviv. And they show the data, and they show some very nice pictures of the eye tracking, recordings of the eye track from the eye tracker.
What is eye tracking? Watching?
Yeah.
What is that?
Eye tracking. Well, the story is that in order to, we try in general in what is called neuroeconomics. People try to understand the ways that people reason. And they try to do it from measuring, typically they measure things using these days the fMRI.
Yeah.
And there are some signals that come from your brain, from your body, or from whatever, that give us some hints about the ways that you reason before you made a decision. Now, again, this is one of probably the most important, interesting developments in economics in the last 5 to 10 years. And again, it's a field that a lot has to be said about the way that it was developed. Personally, what I did with some friends, and because of some reasons, we did some eye tracking experiment for when we gave people to choose between two vectors like X dollars with probability P versus Y dollars with probability Q, and we wanted to see how people reason about it using the eye tracker, which allows us to follow how people, what were the eye movements, namely whether they compared the dollars to the dollars, the probability to probabilities, or whether they made some calculation of like multiplication of the X dollars with the probability P versus the Y dollars with probability Q, etc., etc. Okay. So we did this experiment. I do these sort of experiments mainly because I'm interested in the methodology of economics, and I wanted to understand better how people do these sort of things. And one thing that I learned in my life is that the best way to criticize something and to understand how people do something is to do it yourself. When you do it yourself, then you find the dirty tricks of the field for one side. On the other side, you are also becoming more sympathetic to the difficulties that other people face in their research. In any case, the stories I want to tell you is that we have some very nice movies where you can really look at the movies and look how the eye movements went, and you say, wow, it's very clear what was going on in his mind. Sometimes it's even quite funny. Excellent. Now, I show the 3 or 4 movies to crowd, and then I tell them, look, the entire data that you saw is wrong. And I showed it already to, 20, 30 lectures, and nobody until now realized that why actually the data was wrong. The people could see it because they had actually the entire information and the entire background to make the conclusion that what they saw is in some sense wrong, and they don't see it. And actually, my co-authors and me watched these movies for days and weeks, and until there was some accident that caused us actually to realize that the data was wrong. The data was wrong because what's happened in this particular case is that there was a mistake of the programmer, and actually everything up, down were reversed, flipped down, and whatever was up actually was down, whatever was down was up, and it was and people could realize it because actually all the movements, the eye movement started actually from the bottom. And it's very strange that people started to look at the screen and started to look at it at the screen from the bottom and not from top. Even in a country like Israel, when we read from right to left, we don't read from bottom to top. And but nevertheless, we don't criticize enough the way we take for granted that actually what we see is correct, that the way that the data was recorded and collected was fine, and that we don't search for mistakes in the fundamental mistakes in the ways that we analyze the data. We do look for some statistical tests, which actually are very good tests, or sometimes are good tests for credibility of the data, assuming that everything until up to the point that you ran the statistical test was correct. So. So I think that one thing that I try to encourage in my research or in my lectures other people is to be skeptic about data, about experiments, and not just to check the statistical validity, but to go further to the very fine description of the experiment. These fine details are extremely important and may make a lot of differences.
But this is a general problem. And you pointed out very eloquently in the case of experimental economics and in your paper, which we'll put a link up to, you give some nice examples of the kind of what you might call casualness in the collecting of the data was done or the imprecision of it. Problem I have, and this is true of every type of empirical work, it's not just experimental economics, the researchers don't reveal what they really did. Mm-hmm. They tell us an ex post story that we tested this and it came out, and we were right. And of course, you don't know how many times they ran the regression. You don't know how many specifications they used. You don't know how many times they didn't like the outcome and they said, well, we better try it in a log-log form instead of in the levels. So in the example of the experimental literature, when I read these pop psychology books that purport to teach us some new thing about economics, they'll do some test, and I always ask myself, can you replicate it? If I did the test, would it come out every time that way? Did you just find it once? How many times did you do it? So there's this classic example in a book I like a lot, James Surowiecki's book, The Wisdom of Crowds. There's a lot of interesting things in that book. But one of the things in there is that when you have people guess something, that the mean sometimes is the right answer, even though no individual guess is accurate. And certainly I'm sure that's true sometimes. But I think it's also not true. But for fun, I did an experiment with my class. I filled up a big jar with beans, and I walked around and I asked a bunch of different people how many beans were in the jar to see if the mean would be anything close. And it turned out that almost every single person underestimated how many beans were in the jar. Let's say there were 800, and most people said 500, 600. But of the 30 people I asked, one person said like 8,000. He was off by, it was impossible that there would be 8,000. He just gave a quick look at the jar and he gave a wild guess and he was totally off. But when you included that 8,000, it came out very close to the mean. Now, does that confirm the theory? And if I had been trying to disprove the theory, I would have said to myself, oh, come on, do you really think there's 8,000 in there? And he'd say, well, you're right, 800. And then I would have shown that the theory was wrong. And as you point out in the protocol, was I careful not to do that? Did I keep every outlier? Did I say, well, that's an outlier? And did I pick and choose what to include? Did I run it 3 times before I got that result? So these are the questions I think we need to ask all the time of experimental economics and empirical economics. And we usually don't because, as you say, we're not angels. We confirm our biases.
Yeah. And connected with that, let me make 2 or 3 points. First of all, I think that one thing that has to be changed in economics, and I think that I've heard already many people agree with that point, is that we lack this culture of replication. I think that, you do something original. I'm not sure about it. I am going to run it again. the chances that I will be able to publish it, whatever are the results, are very small. That makes it very rare that people replicate, and if they replicate, I think that usually they have actually the incentives to improve the results and then to make some sort of a secondary experiment that under some different conditions with some changes, and they have something, another phenomenon, but basically they have to replicate to improve actually the original experiment. And I think that this culture is very bad. There is a room, I think, for giving some credits to people who do replications, whether it works or whether it fails. And of course, it has to be evaluated less than a big invention, but nevertheless, I think that the profession does not give any incentives for people to do that. Second, I think that there is a big problem, in my opinion, which is about the protocols that experimental economics use. I think at the moment, experimental economics requires certain protocols which became very rigid and extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult to publish, whether you're a famous person or whether you're a young person. It's very difficult to publish stuff which do not follow these protocols. The protocols require certain incentives. The protocols require, namely, giving subjects some money, and require bring people to what they call laboratories. But laboratory is a nice word to some bunch of computers, that's all. Now, I think the outcome is actually, in my opinion, devastating from academic point of view, because, first of all, the incentives are not serious, and I think that there are several research pieces that shows that actually these amounts that are given are not really incentivize people in the way that makes much difference between this protocol and the protocol when you are telling people you're not going to get any money, but now let's imagine that you are now in a particular situation where such and such thousands of dollars are in stake, and etc., etc. That's because people are very good in fantasies. People are very good in putting themselves in imaginary situations, and then actually I believe that they report about what they would do. Of course, it's not exactly what they would do, but give us some information, which in my opinion is better than what we get in laboratory when we pay $5 to a student for sitting 30 minutes near a computer and doing some very boring game. But I think that the worst of it is that it prevents, at the moment, there are a lot of possibilities to do very huge experiments via the web. I must say that I have to say that myself, I do in the last 8 or 9 years, I do a lot of experiments via the web, and I think that the results that I get are, in my opinion, are not less valuable, and in my opinion even more, because I'm talking about many thousands of subjects and participants, and I think that the results are not less reliable, at least for many of the games or the decision problems that I'm working with, and it's just very difficult to publish it. It's very difficult to draw the attention of the community, because the community requires this sort of protocols. Now, why the community requires this sort of protocols? Let me again push the position or the point of view or draw the attention of economists again that they cannot take the position. I believe that economists cannot take the position. Everybody is economic agents and behaves according to incentives, but we are not. And everybody's firms have behaving like cartels, create cartels, and we are not cartels. I think that the economic profession in certain, at least in certain ways, behave like a cartel. And the cartel has barriers to entry. That's the basic strategy of any cartel, and the cartel of experimental economics puts a barrier to entry, because in some sense it sounds very easy to do experiments, and I think this is one of the misleading facts about for graduate students. Many graduate students who don't succeed to do theory or don't succeed to do very elaborating macro models or whatever, then they feel, okay, we can finish the PhD quite easily because we'll get some money from the supervisor and we'll run some experiments. Usually you get some results, and if you're not critical, definitely you get some results, and we can publish it and we can finish the PhD. And I think that in this respect, what the cartel does is that it puts some higher barriers to entry to prevent that too many people will do these sort of things. But I think that these days, actually, to do experiments, in some sense, people who have good access to the web, good access to subjects around the world, can gather information about the ways that people reason in general, including in strategic and economic situation, much better than putting 30 guys in a lab for 30 minutes.
I just want to make two comments on that, this discussion, then I want to move on. But there was recently an article by Jonah Lehrer, I think in the New Yorker, about a psychologist who had found this surprising, unintuitive result. I forget what it was exactly. But over the years, and he became very honored for this, he became very in demand, his career took off. But over the years, he's realized that finding has not stood up, that when people tried to replicate it, over time, it got smaller and smaller, and now it disappears when people try to test it. And I believe this is not an indication that human behavior has changed over the decade and a half or so, but it's more an honesty about what the experiments revealed. Yeah. The second observation I would make, you made a very interesting point about the power of introspection, and that we accept the conclusions and then we do the experiments. But I have a friend who was reading one of these, again, pop psychology books that was trying to show all these novel, counterintuitive results. And I said to him, he's loving the book. And I said, a lot of those experiments and there's many books like this. I'm not going to name them, but there are many books like this that take the psychology literature and the behavioral economics literature and craft a book around these novel and unintuitive and new paradoxical findings. And I said, a lot of those experiments, I'm not sure they can be replicated. I'm not sure they're reliable. He said to me, "Oh, don't worry. I only believe the ones that make sense to me." So, of course, that's a dangerous road also. So there is a challenge. I'm with you. I'm more tending towards philosophy as I get older and less towards mathematical economics. But there is a challenge that your introspection is prone to confirmation bias. And here I am interviewing you. You're confirming all my biases that I have about experimental economics and game theory. So I have to be careful too.
Yeah.
One more issue that you've been a contrarian, or at least an outspoken person on, maybe not a contrarian. And it sort of, I think, maybe brings together a few of the things you've been talking about.
I think that one thing that I try also to emphasize in the last few years in my writings is that what is economic model. Actually, I wrote a book in Hebrew, which was not published in English, at least not yet, which I called, in Hebrew, it's Agadot HaKalkala, which means economic fables or economic tales. And the basic idea of this book, and that's something which I also emphasize in some other writings, is that my view about economic model in general is that it is a fable, it's a fairy tale. And it's not like, at least my imagination of what is a model in the sciences. Namely, I do treat the model that I build or I invent or other people's models, I treat them as stories. And a good model for me is a good story. The difference, of course, is that the story in the economic literature, economic theory, is written, first of all, it has to be written in formal language, which has pluses and minuses. It has the pluses that it makes the model or the story, in some sense, more clear. On the other end, but on the other end, makes it less clear because this formal language is not necessarily understood by many of the people that are going to use it. But in any case, I think that a good story, a good model, I think about it as really as a story. It has to have the much of the rhythm of a good story. It starts usually with presenting the characters, presenting the economic agents, presenting their motives, and it goes on until the end of the story, what usually people call equilibrium or solution, and so on. But and here uses the big difference between fairy tale and the economic model, the formal economic model, where in the formal model you have some rules how to move from what it seems that you have some rules and you are bound actually to. You cannot just go from the beginning to the end in the ways that the writer wants it to go, but you have to justify the move from the beginning to the end using some abstract concept, some solution concept, and so on. But nevertheless, I think that in many respects, these are the same things. Both fairy tale, fable, and economic model are very unrealistic. They are very unrealistic because they take from the complexity of the world. They take very few elements. They put it usually in a very stylized environment, and in this stylized environment, we are playing in the fable, and we are playing in the economic model. And then at the end of the story, at the end of the model, if the fable is interesting, then at the end of the fable, we feel that we got some sort of an insight about the world, not an insight, not a recommendation to the prime minister what to do, and not an advice to the firm how to behave. But nevertheless, we have some sort of a feeling. We got something about the ways that people are reasoning and about the ways that the world goes. Of course, the social world goes. And I think the same is true about economic model. If economic model is good, then it tells us something about the concepts, about the ways that we reason, and it should be also enjoyable.
Sure. No, it should entertain a little bit. Right. The more dramatic it is, the more surprising it is, the better story it is.
Exactly.
I interviewed Ed Leamer. He wrote a book recently on macroeconomics called Macroeconomic Patterns and Stories, and he tells a very similar tale to Agadot Kalkala, which is, this is what we are. Yep. We don't like to admit it. We like to think that we're doing science.
Exactly.
But we're doing something closer to literature, philosophy, whatever you want to call it. And I think some people, obviously some people in the profession, when they hear that, they bristle, they get angry, they're resentful, they say you're wrong. But then there are other people on the other side who say, okay, so there's nothing to economics. And I think that's not the conclusion, for me anyway, and I'll let you have the last word about what the conclusion is for you. For me, the conclusion isn't that economics is useless because these stories are just stories. Economics is a powerful way of thinking. It's a way of helping you organize your thinking about things that are connected in ways that are not obvious. Economics helps you see things that are hidden, that are unseen, and some of them, the magnitudes we can't measure. We're not measuring the gravitational force of a mass. We're talking about magnitudes we can't always measure, but we can see forces and understand, as you say, insights into human behavior that aren't obvious or that you wouldn't have noticed before. But to pretend that we can use those then to run the economy or to design a mechanism for a public policy is often a charade. And so to me, there's a middle ground. Economics is a useful way of thinking, or I wouldn't be running this podcast every week. But I think we oversell it. And when we do, we get into what Hayek called scientism, not science. The use of scientific language and technique to give the aura of certitude that it doesn't deserve.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Let me just finish with saying that, from time to time I talk with young students, and sometimes some colleagues of mine criticize me on that I deter them from studying economics because I tell them exactly what I was saying now in this interview. But you know what? I learned from my experience, actually in some sense the opposite. Namely, it may be that I do deter some students or future students who want to come to economics because they believe that if they study economics, they will make money. So maybe they conclude that it's better for them to study business administration or finance or whatever, or just to start business. But on the other hand, I think that the students that really economic at the moment needs, namely people with wide minds and openness to new ideas and eagerness to come up with really new solutions in the real sense to the problems of the world, those more idealistic students actually are finding this approach to economics much more attractive than telling them some false facts about the usefulness of economic studies to their pocket or to their ability to give it good advice to the finance minister.
My guest today has been Ariel Rubinstein of Tel Aviv University and New York University. Ariel, thanks for being part of Econ Talk.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
This is Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more Econ Talk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for Econ Talk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.